In today's video, we're going to be dealing with devotion, or devotionalism, in early Buddhist practice. Now, devotion is a topic which is very difficult for some of us, while for others of us, it's like the water that we swim in. So we'll try to tease apart a bit of this and find some of the nuances involved. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Respect, devotion, veneration, reverence, these are all words that are kind of hallmarks of what we might term a religious approach we find in religions in general. This idea that there are some people, even some objects, some places that are better than others, that are wiser than others, that are more powerful in some sense than others, and that we should have a certain kind of internal attitude towards. And this idea of devotion or reverence is difficult for some of us, difficult for those of us of a more secular bent, and I include myself in that category. Perhaps because it may seem somewhat servile or obsequious, like we're sort of pushing ourselves down or tending to suck up to somebody, treat them as a king when they're really just a person. These kinds of issues, I think, are issues that we all have to deal with. And it can help, I think, historically, to get a perspective on early Buddhism, on how these ideas came across in early Buddhism and what the Buddha had to say about them. We see devotional practices in traditional forms of Buddhism around the world. Indeed, we might even say that devotional practices are, in some sense, the majority of Buddhist practices for lay people and perhaps even monastics around the world. They're really central. So I think it does behoove us to take a look at them. Now, what was the Buddha's attitude towards devotion? I would say it's a nuanced attitude, as is true for so many things. The Buddha had a very nuanced opinion of devotionalism, or devotion in general. And what I'd like to do to get that across is to look first at devotion in the broader sense in early Buddhism, devotion about various things, and then later on to look at devotionalism towards the Buddha himself in early Buddhism. So to begin with, let's start with looking at devotionalism, respect, devotionalism, veneration in the broader sense in early Buddhism. In the broader sense, it's considered wrong view to hold that there aren't people who have higher attainments than others. In particular, we might say if we're lay people who are just starting out on the path, it would be wrong view to hold that there aren't people who are farther along than we are. People who have higher attainments, people who are wiser than we are, should we say. People who have insight into the way the world is, in some sense of insight. And that has gotten across in many ways. In particular, we're expected, certainly in early Buddhism, it's expected that lay people are going to have respect, devotion for monastics. And it's also expected that monastics are going to have respect or devotion or veneration towards particularly accomplished monastics or particularly elder monastics within their communities. And we might say that this attitude of right view, that there are certain people who are more accomplished than others, there are certain people who are wiser than others, this would be sort of one of the prerequisites, or perhaps the prerequisite for a devotional attitude or an attitude of respect. Here, I should say that there are a number of terms here that I've used: respect, devotion, veneration, that are, in English at least, along a kind of a spectrum. Respect is a little bit closer to an everyday kind of sense, whereas devotion, veneration are a little bit more towards the religious end of things. But these are, I would say, common kinds of ideas, common kinds of emotions that we can have. And these are emotions, again, based on the idea that there are certain people who know more than others or who are wiser than others, certain people worthy of respect. And having such an attitude is a good antidote towards egoism on our own part, because I think a lot of us naturally tend to be of the opinion that we know everything, or that there's nobody really better than us. And that can lead towards a kind of egoism, a kind of a sense that we shouldn't be corrected because the other person isn't ever going to know any more than we do. And that can be a very problematic kind of emotion to get into. But as I said earlier, respect has to be earned. Devotion has to be earned, in early Buddhism in particular. That is, it's not the case that that every monastic is worthy of respect for the Buddha. A monastic has to earn their respect. There's an early sutta where the Buddha discusses this in a I think, a very funny kind of way. He talks about the monastic who is not worthy of respect or veneration. He compares such a person to a donkey who is following the cows along the road, and the donkey believes that it can moo like a cow. And the upshot here is that the donkey is kind of an absurd figure. A donkey can't moo. A donkey is a totally different kind of creature. And so he says, just like the donkey who's following the cows and thinks it can moo, so too is the monastic who is not pursuing proper practice and yet expects to be somebody worthy of respect and devotion. In a different sutta, the monastic Mahakachana is sharing some time with some Brahmins, Brahmin elders. That is to say, they're not followers of the Buddha, they're Brahmins. And he is rebuked by one of the Brahmins, a Brahmin elder, because he, Mahakachana, is not venerating the elder Brahmins around him. He's not standing up when they come in the room. He's not bowing down to them, even though they're his elders. He's not doing the typical kinds of, he's not showing the typical kinds of respect that one is expected to show to elder Brahmins. And Mahakachana says that to him, being an elder is something different. To him, being an elder doesn't mean being old. To him, being an elder means not being infatuated with sense pleasures. And he says, Mahakachana says, that on that, in that respect, these elders are in fact youths, because they themselves are still infatuated with sense pleasures. And as a result, he doesn't feel the need to venerate them. He would venerate them if they were going to give up their sense pleasures, if they were going to stop being attached to them. But since they aren't, he isn't going to venerate them. And this is an exact way that the Buddha would tend to turn around concepts of his day. He would turn them around so that they were no longer about outward forms, that is to say, being literally older than somebody else, into something more about ethics. So being an elder isn't about the outward form of actually having more years than somebody else, but being an elder means behaving in a fashion that is most skillful. So we see from these instances that in the broader context, the idea of reverence or veneration, respect in the Buddha's day, was to be given to people for their practice, for being ethical, for practicing ethically, for their meditative accomplishments, for their wisdom, and not simply because of outward forms. One was not simply to be respected because they had monastic robes on, because some people with monastic robes are not worthy of veneration or respect. They're not simply to be respected because they're a certain age, because not everybody who's old is worthy of veneration and respect. So that's the general case. Now, the case of the Buddha in particular. We may know that in the Buddha's day, when people would decide to join the Buddha, or decide that they agreed with the Buddha's Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, they would typically say that they were going to take refuge, that they were taking refuge in what we call the three jewels. the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the first of those is refuge in the Buddha. And that's in particular to say that you are venerating him as your teacher. You're taking him as your teacher. He was, of course, alive at the time, and so he was a literal person, and so you were going to say that you respected his teaching so much and him as a teacher that you were going to venerate him as a teacher. And of course, in ancient India, to do that was really a matter of high respect and veneration, in a way that in the West nowadays we've gotten away from this notion that teachers are to be venerated. In olden days, shall we say, there was more of that sense. The Buddha also recommended a practice of recollections, various recollections, but three of those recollections were the recollections of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And if we're focusing on the Buddha himself, they would have been recollections of the Buddha in a kind of, it's not entirely clear, but I think the connotation here is that one is going to be recollecting him in a kind of a devotional sense. One is going to be thinking about the Buddha's good character, using that as a model for ourselves. So if we're getting lost in doubts and in concerns about our practice, then perhaps recollecting the Buddha, who perhaps we would have seen in person and seen as a teacher in person and have an idea of in our minds from direct experience, then we can try to recollect that. Now, most of, a large portion of what we consider nowadays to be devotional practices around the Buddha in particular come from one particular sutta, which is called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the sutta which outlines the end of the Buddha's life. It's quite a detailed and lengthy sutta, and goes into a lot of detail about what happened in the months prior to his death, his final death, and then what happened in the days and weeks after he died. And so this is a very, very important sutta, a very important piece of information about the Buddha's life, and in particular about aspects that we retain today of veneration. And in particular in that sutta, the Buddha discusses 4 places that he feels we should make pilgrimage to. And he discusses 4 kinds of people that one should make monuments for, or what are called stupas in ancient India, that one should build these monuments for. 4 sorts of people that are worthy of having monuments built for them. And we also learn at the end of the sutta about the existence of relics, the Buddha's relics, the remains. So the Buddha, after he died, was burned, as was typical in ancient India for people of high standing. And then the earthly remains were gathered up and distributed to people at the time, people of importance. And we learn about the beginnings of this kind of relic worship, if you like. And the 4 holy places that the Buddha said it would be fine for us to do pilgrimage to were the place that he was born, the place that he attained awakening, the place that he gave his first sermon, which is to say the sort of the beginning of the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, and the place that he passed away. Now, of course, he hadn't passed away at the time, but he sort of believed that he was going to pass away in the near future, so that's why presumably he would have said that. Now, it's also, and I think particularly important to know why he said this. He was not saying that it was required of us to make this kind of pilgrimages or these kinds of pilgrimages. It's not like we find in, let's say, Islam. It's not required in any sense. And it's not like it's a kind of a magical thing if we do it. It's rather that the Buddha says that these places are places of inspiration for us, or could become or be places of inspiration. They could give us perhaps energy to practice better, because being in these places gives us a kind of an emotional energy. And so he recommends them because of their inspirational qualities, and not because of anything necessary or essential. We can do the practice just as well without going to these places. Now, pilgrimages like these went hand in hand, or go hand in hand, with the building of stupas and monuments. That is to say, you would build a monument or a stupa at a place of pilgrimage, among other places perhaps, and go and venerate at that monument, a place where you could go. And the scholar Pia Tan has talked about stupas and notes that not always were stupas associated with relics. Oftentimes they were. In other words, a stupa was built as a kind of a container around what was believed to be a relic of the Buddha, let's say. But Pia Tan suggests that that's not always the case. This is something of an item of dispute, it seems, in the scholarship. But in any event, the Buddha said that there were 4 types of people who were worthy of having a monument like this built to them. The first were Buddhas, like himself, that is, somebody who discovered the path and taught it to a broad audience. The second would have been what he called lone Buddhas, that is, people who became completely awakened completely by themselves without having learned the Dharma from anybody else, but who did not teach. Obviously, we'd have to say they didn't teach widely, because obviously if they didn't teach anybody, then there wouldn't be a stupa built, but presumably they might have taught a small group of people. The third would have been disciples of the Buddha. So the Buddha is saying here that disciples, presumably disciples of some high standing, were themselves worthy of monuments. And the fourth was what he called wheel-turning monarchs. A wheel-turning monarch in early Buddhism is a person who rules a wide area. They have taken over a wide area and rule justly, rule according to the Dharma in some sense. We can think of somebody like King Ashoka, who was the earliest Buddhist monarch, as an example of such a person. So he says that a wheel-turning monarch is also somebody worthy of a monument like this. But again, I think, as with the case of pilgrimages, we have to ask why. Why are these monuments to be built? What was the point of them? And the point, says the Buddha, is that they, he says, gladden the hearts of people who look on them. They give us, again, a kind of inspiration. They make us happier. They lead, the Buddha says, to better rebirths. That is to say that contemplating these kinds of monuments to good people, to just rulers and wise teachers, wise individuals, that gladdens our hearts, that turns us in a positive direction and leads to better rebirths. And we may know that in traditional Buddhism, doing things ethically, being an ethical person, leads to a better next life. But that was not the aim of the Dharma. The aim of the Dharma in general was to escape the rounds of birth and death. So what the Buddha is saying here, essentially, is that the aim of a stupa, the aim of a monument like this, is worldly. It's directed basically at lay practice, at lay people who are not expected to attain awakening for themselves, but we want to give them something that gladdens their hearts, that turns their minds in the right direction. But it's not really an element of the world-embracing or world-transcending path, we might say. Now, as for the Buddha's relics, to my knowledge, the Buddha never actually discusses his relics himself. It's something that took off after he died, and the people around him wanted pieces of his physical remains to inter in stupas and to give themselves a kind of power and legitimacy. And Pia Tan discusses some ideas of S.J. Tambaya, who's another scholar of early Buddhism, who discusses some of the issues with relics over the years and how they became commodified, essentially. We find the idea of relics, as in the West, growing over time. Indeed, the number of relics seems to grow over time. It's claimed often that these new relics are miraculous in some sense or another, but I think many of us may believe that this happens because of greed on the part of certain people who want to expand their potential reach of their power, and so essentially construct relics or make something into a quote-unquote relic. This is a form, I think, of, or can certainly become a form of spiritual materialism. I did an earlier video on that. I'll put a link to it down below. This idea that what we're after along the spiritual path is a form of acquisition of things, acquisition of abilities, acquisition of either mental or physical advances. And when we think of a path in those terms, it tends to degrade that path. And I think that's particularly the case when we come to physical things, such as relics. This idea that the more relics one owns or has, the more spiritual power, in some sense, one possesses. And so the idea then becomes not so much one of ethical behavior, as we saw earlier on, but rather one of simply acquiring more physical things of a certain kind. And I think when we get into that kind of mindset, we've really gone quite far away from the original message of the Buddha. Now, Piatan notes, he's a scholar of early Buddhism, he notes that the Buddha seems to have tolerated a stupa worship. He didn't think it was a bad idea, but he didn't really specifically endorse it either. And I'll put a link to, I've mentioned him a couple of times here, I'll put a link to his paper down below. It's quite good on this Mahaparinibbana Sutta that we've been discussing here, which really does outline a lot of these devotional practices. And in any event, these practices do, as I've mentioned before, seem to be lay-directed. They're directed towards lay people. In particular, we don't find monastics involved in the burial, or I should say the burning and the distribution of relics after the Buddha's death. That seems to have been done by the lay audience. So the implication here is that the monastics are really not involved with those kinds of things. That's more people who are interested in better rebirth, shall we say, in a certain kind of access to this life benefits rather than to awakening itself. Now, we may also wonder about the historicity, that is to say, whether this is actually accurate about these statements of the Buddha, about the pilgrimage sites, and about the people worthy of monuments built to them. The scholar, the French scholar André Barreau has argued that neither of these things can be dated back to the Buddha himself, that both of them probably arose in the centuries after the Buddha. We might think in the age of Ashoka, who himself, as we've mentioned, had stupas, great monuments built to himself and to the Buddha around India. It certainly is possible that André Barreau's reasoning is that we don't find these passages in every recension of this material. That is to say, this sutta that we've been discussing exists in various different languages, and these don't occur in all of those languages. So it may be that this was derived later. However, it's important also to say that other scholars, such as A.K. Warder, do seem to think that they go back at least as far back as we can tell. More important, I think, would be to look at other passages within the early suttas for an idea of the Buddha's general opinion about devotion, about devotional practices. And I think there are a couple of different passages that shed a great deal of light on the Buddha's opinion. One of those involves a Brahmin who has gone to one of the holy rivers in India to do what are called ritual ablutions, that is to say, a kind of a devotional washing of oneself in the waters of this sacred river. And this is a Brahmin named Sundarika, and Sundarika asks the Buddha, basically they have a conversation why the Buddha doesn't do this himself. And the Buddha says that this kind of ritual devotion, this kind of ritual ablution or washing, is not effective. That the truly effective washing is the internal washing that is involved in true ethical practice. So the external washing does nothing. The internal washing is what does the work. And then the Buddha says basically that once you've done this internal washing, you can externally wash yourself in any well or river you want. They'll all clean you just as well. And this is, I think, a perfect example of the Buddha's attitude towards ritual devotionalism. That ritual devotionalism isn't really effective. It may, as he says in other places, gladden the heart. It is not completely ineffective. It has an effect on our emotional, perhaps happiness. It perhaps puts us in the right frame of mind. But it doesn't do the true work. The true work has to be done after we do that, in our practice with ethics, with meditation, with correct seeing of the world that leads to wisdom. The second of these cases occurs in this Mahaparinibbana Sutta again, the sutta at the end of his life. And this is a short little vignette passage where the Buddha is getting close to death, and he lies down between two sal trees with his close attendant Ananda by his side. And he seems to have had a kind of a vision. He seems to have had a vision of these sal trees blooming in the wrong season. It was out of season for their blooming. And when they bloom, the petals fall upon him. And also there's sandalwood powder falls from the sky upon him, which is very beautiful fragrance. And he seems to hear choirs and music singing and playing off in the distance. And this to me is an example of somebody, or it seems to at least picture somebody in that sort of liminal state between life and death, who is perhaps having certain kinds of visions or illusions going on in their minds. But the Buddha sees these, interestingly, as devotional practices, perhaps of the gods, that the gods or people, somebody is responsible for these kinds of things, that they are showing the Buddha a kind of devotion, a kind of reverence by sprinkling these leaves and sprinkling this powder and singing this music for him. That is, these are forms of what we might call worldly veneration. And what's really interesting in this passage is the Buddha's response to this veneration, what he sees as veneration. He doesn't respond quite the way you might expect. What the Buddha says to Ananda is, that's not how the realized one, that is the Buddha, is honored, respected, revered, venerated, and esteemed. Any monk or nun or male or female lay follower who practices in line with the teachings, practicing properly, living in line with the teachings, they honor, respect, revere, venerate, and esteem the realized one with the highest honor. So, Ananda, you should train like this. We shall practice in line with the teachings, practicing properly, living in line with the teaching. Living in line with the teaching. That is, what the Buddha at the end of his life says, I think most clearly, is that the proper form of devotion for the Buddha, if we want to do such, the proper form of devotion is to practice well, is not to do ritual kinds of ablutions or ritual kinds of practices, such as sprinkling something or singing music or whatever, but instead to practice in line with the teaching. That is to say, to behave ethically, to do meditation, and to pursue wisdom as best we can. Other forms of devotion are not bad. They may indeed gladden our hearts, they may inspire us in various ways, but they aren't the heart of real devotional practice in early Buddhism. And here I think we do see something of a coming together of a more, we might say, secular ideal of devotion with an early Buddhist ideal, where the early Buddhist ideal really is less about the outward, shall we say, physical practices of ablutions for somebody, and more about correct practice. And on all of these notes, I think it's important to keep in mind, and I think these highlight the way in which the Buddha comes across as a real human. And I have an earlier video on whether the Buddha was indeed sort of a god or a human, because he's portrayed in various ways at various times. And I'll put a link to that video up here on the screen if you want to take a look at it. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for your attention, your kind attention. I hope all of you will be well, and we'll see you on the next video.